However, they were also doing this mission to Henderson Island, which is an uninhabited atoll right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's incredibly hard to get there, and it's absolutely covered in plastic. And they were going to do this mission to clean up this beach, but they didn't have a scientist on board. And I had just finished my PhD, so luckily enough, I was invited. And it was one of the hardest physically and mentally things I've ever done. It took, almost 4 days of travel to get to this island. When you're on this island, the closest human beings are likely on the International Space Station because you're so remote in the middle of the ocean, basically. And you find this beautiful paradise of a beach, and you slowly approach it with a boat. And as you get closer and closer and you're looking through your binoculars, you realize that it's not just a beautiful beach, it's absolutely covered in plastic. So we landed on shore with about 13 people, and we not only cleaned the beach of about 9 tons of plastic, we also conducted scientific studies to understand, no human lives on this island, yet so much plastic ends up there.
Life in plastic.
Hi, Hannah, and Happy New Year, and thanks for being here with me today.
Hi, Joel. Good to see you. It's early for me, so apologies that I'm still waking up a bit, but looking forward to being here.
No worries. It's good to be early in this year because we expect a lot to happen. And this conversation will also look back at 2025 a little bit. And the main goal of this conversation is to understand a bit about the plastic treaty, where are we coming from, what happened in 2025, what are the different positions, where are we headed to in 2026. And you also represent a very specific alliance that Cleanup is also part of. So I want to talk about that a little bit as well. So I would say let's use the time wisely and jump right in. Maybe you can give a quick intro on yourself. How did you come to work in the plastic treaty space?
Sounds good. So my name is Dr. Hanna Dijkstra, and I'm a plastic solution researcher, consultant, and communicator. And I have a bit of a winding path to get to the treaty because my PhD was first looking at innovations and entrepreneurs focused on the problem of ocean plastic pollution. And that's actually how we met for the first time. I interviewed you during my PhD research. And after I graduated, I realized that the problem, even though there was so much happening from the innovator space, everyone always talked about the importance of regulation and policy. And so since I graduated, I got to sort of expand my scope, and I worked, many different fields. So from collecting plastic on a remote island with Plastic Odyssey, but also joining the Innovation Alliance for the Global Plastics Treaty, which is an advocacy group looking specifically at this large international United Nations treaty process. So I like to say that I've done the macro to the micro, looking at the problem of plastic pollution and also looking for solutions. And so for the past, let's say, few years, I've been really tracking the United Nations Plastic Treaty. And for those that don't know what it is, it's basically an international attempt to create a legally binding framework to regulate and basically just regulate plastic. And there's a bunch of debates about exactly what that looks like. But in essence, it's if you have this international framework that all these countries agree on, it's then a lot easier to translate that into national policies, regional policies, understand standardized definitions, and kind of have this coherence in the regulatory landscape, which can be very beneficial for startups, but also for corporations. And hopefully it also ends up creating the outcome that we all intend, which is ending or at least significantly reducing plastic pollution.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to dive into that topic. But before we get into the boardrooms in Geneva and where else, I quickly want to go on to your mission with Plastic Odyssey on this remote island. Maybe you can tell a bit about that so that everybody coming out of the holidays remembers why we do this in the first place. Why did you do that?
Yeah, and it's a really inspiring story, an exciting story for me. So after I finished my PhD, I was working on a lot of different projects and was lucky enough to link up with Plastic Odyssey, which is an organization that has a vessel that's been sailing around the world doing plastic pollution education and advocacy really on the small scale, visiting ports in places where pollution is most of a problem. However, they were also doing this mission to Henderson Island, which is an uninhabited atoll right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's incredibly hard to get there, and it's absolutely covered in plastic. And so we got to talking, and they were going to do this mission to clean up this beach, but they didn't have a scientist on board. And I had just finished my PhD, so luckily enough, I was invited. And it was one of the hardest physically and mentally things I've ever done. It took, almost 4 days of travel to get to this island. When you're on this island, the closest human beings are likely on the International Space Station because you're so remote in the middle of the ocean, basically. And you find this beautiful paradise of a beach, and you slowly approach it with the boat. And as you get closer and closer and you're looking through your binoculars, you realize that it's not just a beautiful beach, it's absolutely covered in plastic. So we landed on shore with about 13 people, and we not only cleaned the beach of about 9 tons of plastic, we also conducted scientific studies to understand, we're talking about plastic here in Europe or in North America or wherever else in the world, but it's not only affecting us where we use it, it also ends up in the oceans. It ends up on these islands. Like, no human lives on this island, yet so much plastic ends up there. So for me, it was really inspiring. I had worked many years behind my computer to really get my hands dirty. So I was on this beach, working in the hot sun, picking up plastic, counting plastic, weighing it. And the great thing about Plastic Odyssey is they have an onboard recycling lab. So we also brought the plastic on board and was able to make products out of the plastic we collected.
Well, it sounds like a great adventure.
It was great, yeah. Yeah.
How's life on board? Can we imagine it like a 5-star resort or more like?
No. I would say closer to a hostel. I mean, it's an old research vessel that they recommissioned into this, floating plastic laboratory. They put a bunch of new equipment on it. So it's really cool when it's at port and you can walk around and it's got this recycling lab. When it's floating or sailing in the middle of the ocean, all of that equipment just means that it rocks and rolls so much. So seasickness, which is something I never experienced, I always thought I had good sea legs, hits you hard. And also there's something crazy about being on a boat for 2 days and not seeing land. Maybe not even seeing a bird. Like, there were times where even seeing a bird was special because you were really out in the middle of nowhere. So there's something really special about that level of remoteness, but it's also a bit freaky. I don't know. It was really special, and you get really close with people on board. Definitely.
What did you do in these 4 days traveling?
We did a lot of but there's a lot of preparation to do. But to be honest, for those of us that got really bad seasickness, you just kind of sleep because that's where you feel best. But besides that, we were preparing all of the equipment because when we were on Henderson, we camped. So we had to get all of our gear ready. There was a lot of water and food that we had to bring with us onto shore. And for myself also was getting ready, like, all of the scientific experiments and monitoring studies that I was going to do. But mostly it's sleeping, and the anticipation is slowly building because you imagine sort of like the ancient age of exploration when you haven't seen land at that point it was months, and then you see land and you're like, land! That's kind of how it felt. Only 4 days, but still, when you're like, oh my gosh, it's land.
Sounds fantastic. And then you landed in Henderson. What did you learn on the island?
So they had done a cleanup 5 years ago, and so everyone was a bit holding their breath to see, okay, things had been cleaned 5 years ago. What does it look like now? Because hardly anyone has visited the island since. Some scientists and some of the local Pitcairners, which is a habited island, which is the closest island that has people living on it, and there's about 50 people that live there, and they're sort of the stewards the stewards of Henderson. But because it's so challenging to get there, people don't visit very often. And so we landed on shore. We realized how much plastic there was. We did the monitoring studies, and basically what we found is the majority of the waste was likely coming from a fishing or maritime origin, so either being lost at sea or being intentionally dumped. Lots of things were like fishing crates or helmets or things that you would find on a fishing vessel. Lots of fishing gear and buoys. I mean, we removed 1,500 buoys. And you strung them into a large chain on a strand of basically fishing net. And so you can move the fishing buoys that way. So it looks really beautiful, but it's quite staggering when you see this like endless chain of buoys. And of course, Henderson doesn't produce any buoys, so they're coming from somewhere.
But no packaging?
Hardly. I mean, there are some PET bottles, but not so much packaging, just because the way that the ocean currents move. It's likely that a lot of this waste has been floating for a long time before it lands on Henderson. And so any sort of light packaging would dissolve or sink. So some PET bottles that had the lid on them, which can float for a long time, have landed. So we found almost 1,000 PET bottles, and any that had a label, we attempted to identify where that label came from. But it's not so clear, because if there's a label from Serbia, for example, you're not going to say this was thrown into a river in Serbia. It was, it could have been on a cruise ship where someone had it, or it could be, a brand that's actually servicing a different country or country's vessel. So you can't say as much, but you can show just the diversity of sources, because I think we found 20 or more countries of origin. Primarily Hong Kong.
Which brings us back to the initial topic, the
Yes.
international treaty, right? It's not just one industry, it's not just one country, but it's a global issue. There's just one ocean, it's all interconnected, so we need some binding tissue legally as well. The world decided that they want to negotiate this treaty. Can you give a bit of or looking back, what were the big milestones?
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, I think just tying it together also with my experience on Henderson, it's like, we all reflected after leaving that island that we could come here every year or every 5 years and clean it up, but that was only going to really focus on the symptoms and not the cause. And so having like stronger regulation, so not only something like the Plastics Treaty, but also MARPOL, which is the marine pollution regulation on shipping and maritime waste. So it's like there's many different policies that are important. The Plastics Treaty is sort of hopefully this sort of guiding light that can unify everything that's happening in a more fragmented industry and sectors. And it started in 2000. Now I have to maybe look up my dates to get them right, but it started with this resolution at the end of 2022, where all of the countries at UNEA, and UNEA is the United Nations Environment Assembly that meets every year, they all adopted this resolution that they said, we want to develop a treaty to regulate plastic pollution, not production. That's one of the key issues. So all the countries sort of stood up and said, we agree to this. It was a historic moment because it was, really widely accepted. There was this discussion that within the next 2 years, this treaty would be decided upon and adopted. And from then on, it would then go into the process of being translated into national and regional policies. So it's not like you say, we want this treaty, you agree on it, and all of a sudden it starts happening. It's a really slow process. So once that was adopted, we then moved into the negotiation sessions. So if you've seen anything about INC, this means Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee, INC for short. These are basically when all of those countries that said, yes, we want a treaty, meet together and try to decide what do we actually talk about in that treaty. So we've had 6 of those for now. In 2025, there was one in the summer in Switzerland in Geneva. This was supposed to be the last negotiation session after the previous one, which was supposed to be the last negotiation session, did not end in a treaty. And so the news headlines and everyone started saying, okay, this one really is the last. And then in Geneva, where I was this summer, we realized it's not the last. It probably won't be the last for a long time. And I think everyone who really believed in that 2-year timeline has kind of abandoned that and is now realizing this is, almost 200 countries that we're trying to get to agree on something that will influence their governments. It'll influence their industry. It'll influence their trade and their taxes. It's not so simple for them to just sign off on something. And so what we see within the treaty process is there's kind of 2 camps of countries that are emerging, and they have names. So there's the High Ambition Coalition, which, as it sounds, they want a really strong treaty. They want this to be ambitious. They want it to cover, the full life cycle, which includes production caps, so limiting production, not just focusing on waste management. And they really hold on to this fact that, we agreed to end plastic pollution, and the only way to do that is to address the full life cycle. And they also really advocate for the links between climate and the links with health and social justice and that sort of thing, because they're often these countries that are dealing with the problems of plastic pollution, even if they're not necessarily the major producers. So this is the EU, small island states, lots of countries in Latin America and Africa. So ambitious coalition, high ambition coalition. On the other hand, we have the like-minded coalition, which is kind of an ambiguous name, but basically these are often this group is comprised of the fossil fuel and petrochemical producing countries. So many of them are based in the Middle East, and they're really saying, hey, we agreed to end plastic pollution, and to do that we should improve waste management. So they are advocating for a much narrower scope. And they also say, this has to be voluntary, this has to be phased. It's unfeasible to expect that all countries adopt the same regulations or reach the same target. So they don't want binding regulations, and they're focusing much more on waste management, and do not agree with any sort of references to caps in production or specific targets. So as you can imagine, these two countries or these two coalitions sit on very opposite ends of the spectrum and what they see the treaty happening. And what ends up happening in these negotiation processes is all of these countries send their representatives, they sit in these big rooms, they have a very slow and bureaucratic procedure to talk through every single word and comma and line of text. And a country from this side will say, yes, we need this. A country from this side will say no. And then the whole day can basically be spent arguing over a word, a sentence, whether the text should say must or should or could, that sort of thing. And so that's how basically a week in Geneva was spent with this stalemate, and that's where we are now.
So it's a lot about the right wording, and in the end, there's the common ground to end plastic pollution, but how a world without plastic pollution looks like, there's different perspectives on it. And what I find so interesting is that you have those that benefit from producing plastic, and those nations typically are also financially rather stable, probably have their waste management, they don't suffer from pollution. And then on the other side, you have those that, where you could say, yeah, they benefit from the convenience of plastic as a consumer product as well, but they also suffer the most from the consequences. The people in these countries suffer the most from the consequences, and they are typically not those countries that can really afford to implement waste management at the level as you have in other nations, right? And if I would have no opinion on it, I would say like I can kind of understand both sides. And now and this doesn't mean that I'm not advocating from the high ambition, which I am. But the question is, how do we move forward from here, right? Because it feels like 2025 was a year of a lot of disappointment, of blocking. I mean, it's always interesting to go to the INC or into that week of INC because you meet everyone from the industry and it's good conversations, but you walk out and it feels like not much moved. Is that a fair summary, or would you say things did move in 2025?
I think that's a fair summary. I think at the end of 2024, we had the INC in Busan, which was technically supposed to be the last one. And everyone, a lot of organizations sent their best people. They really devoted the time to that. And when that INC ended in a stalemate, I think a lot of people lost hope. And Geneva was almost a bit of a repetition of that. So I think, the two coalitions sort of really dug their heels in and said, we're not moving on this. There was talk about whether, because the original mandate was on 2 years, it hadn't happened in 2 years, that maybe the resolution would run out and this whole process would basically be scrapped because of the stalemate. And in 2025, the chair, so he's basically the judge that's presiding over this whole process, resigned. which was also quite shocking because, he's been leading this whole process, which is a very complicated and challenging process. So right now, I think a lot of people are left a bit stunned and also unsure what happens next, because the next order of business, which is going to be a 1-day meeting in February, on February 7th, so basically a month from today, it'll be a 1-day meeting to vote for the new chair, or choose the new chair, and the chair has to be chosen by consensus, so everyone has to agree. So that might not even happen. There might not even be agreement on who the chair is, and so there's a bit of this. It feels like maybe we're moving backwards, that now, delay is also a tactic. So a country that really focuses on delay can say, hey, we're participating in good faith in this process, but not so secretly, we're just trying to delay it. Because if we delay it, then we can say we tried our best, we sat at all the meetings, we held our ground, we said what we believed in. It's not our fault that this treaty never happened. We were there, we were participating. So delay is becoming a tactic. And I'm curious to see what happens in February, in a month from now, because I think choosing a new chair has the potential to sort of re-energize this. It's somebody new who's going to lead this very bureaucratic process, but there's creative ways to do that more efficiently, more effectively, build consensus, that sort of thing. So I think this year, hopefully we see more movement. There was talk, of is it better to sort of move forward with a smaller group of countries that are more ambitious? But I think in general, those discussions have kind of backed off in favor of, look, all these countries said they wanted to participate. Even if we get a treaty that is weaker than we want, it's not as ambitious, more focused on, let's say, waste management, more focused on voluntary targets, there's no reason we can start there and build, right? So there are certain benefits to just starting with something that everyone agrees on, even if it is only a piece of what, someone like in the High Ambition Coalition would advocate for. There's also really a benefit of just speaking the same language. So in a treaty like this, which is, similar with what's happening in the climate treaty, once you have definitions for key words and key chemicals and key targets, then at least you're speaking the same language too. And it's sort of from the highest regulatory body saying, this is what we mean when we say plastic. This is what we mean when we say pollution. This is what we mean when we say recyclable. And then all of the countries and businesses as well, which is really good for businesses, can work within that framework. So I don't think hope is all lost. I think also there's a bit of a recognition that this is a really slow process. And for people who come from the startup background, like us, we think things move fast. Things do not move fast in policy, and they definitely don't move fast in international policy.
No, I think the Paris Agreement took, 30 years? Something like that.
Exactly.
Which should not be an excuse to not move faster. I have so many questions. So first of all, you were in the room in Geneva, no? In the negotiation room.
I was at Geneva, but I did not. I was not able to get my observer pass in time. So I was at Geneva, but I was not in the room.
Yeah,
but I've been in the room before.
Yeah. What's the energy in that room? Like when you were in the room before?
Yeah. So I was in Ottawa in Canada. So there was a meeting in 2024 in Ottawa where I was in the room. I was not in the room for very long because honestly, these bureaucratic processes are so slow. There's a very specific order that must be followed. So like, let's say the chairs begin the session and they say, we want to talk about financing.
Let's talk about financing.
Immediately, a handful of countries will request the floor. So I don't know if you've seen these pictures of the UN rooms where each country has their microphone and they've got their translation earpieces on. And they basically have a button that says, I want to be in line. And so they press that and then they get 2 minutes. And usually they start by saying, hello, I'm the delegate from this country and we really believe in this. And there's sort of some pomp and circumstance about it. And then maybe they say something controversial. And then immediately a handful of other countries will demand the floor to rebuff or rebuke what that country has said. So it can get quite heated, but it is in a very slow way, like debates happen very slowly because they follow this order. So sometimes this person that has a really, or this country that has a really, quippy rebuttal to another point will only be 10 speakers down the line. So it's like this disjointed, bureaucratic discussion that the first time I went in, I didn't follow at all, and I left immediately because I thought it's a waste of my time to be watching this. But you can see that there are some people that are, watching this like it's a Wimbledon match. So
yeah, not something for my self-diagnosed ADHD brain for sure.
exactly.
Are smartphones allowed in the room? Because I think maybe
Yes.
the negotiation would move faster if everybody would have to leave their phone at the door. So you can't
Yeah.
do other stuff, and everybody wants
Yeah.
to finish.
True, but I think,
Interesting.
like I said, delay is a tactic. So some people,
Yeah.
the fact that it's going slow is great because it means that they don't, reach an
Yeah.
agreement.
And right now we don't have a chair. Are there already? Is it like with electing a pope that nobody really knows who it's going to be, and there's going to be a small circle of people that people think it might be, or?
I think it would be great if they implemented the Pope voting system, behind closed doors.
Just
So,
don't burn plastic.
yeah, no, definitely not. No, there have been a few. I have to look it up to see the exact names, but there have been, basically, there's a candidate that represents more of the like-minded coalition, and there's a candidate that represents more of the high ambition. And they've already publicly, been nominated. And we had the UNEA, this United Nations Environment Assembly meeting in December, and those countries and those candidates were already discussing, why they basically canvassing for why they should be chair. So, but a lot of that happens in like bilateral and closed door meetings. So that's not a very public, it's not a very public campaigning like you see in certain presidential elections. But I think it will be interesting to see what happens in a month, whether it's controversial or, it could be relatively easy. This type of thing hasn't happened yet.
Okay. But basically our crystal ball is quite foggy. We can't see beyond February. Is that the case? So we don't even know if there's going to be a chair in February, and we don't know once there is a chair how the process continues, or is there at least some clarity?
So I'm an optimist always. So in my mind, I believe there will be a chair in February, even if maybe it's a little bit of a drawn out process. I think it would be pretty disheartening if we left that meeting without a new chair. And I think the whispers and those who've been tracking this and other treaty negotiation processes longer than me believe that there will be another negotiation session, likely end of summer, early fall. And maybe that will be one that's a bit longer. I think something that's really been talked about is having stronger intersessional work. So we have these big meetings where almost 200 countries meet, speaking different languages, coming from different time zones, expecting to sort of like develop this complicated piece of text. So can we, in fact, give these countries homework assignments and have them all come at the ready to the next meeting with a lot of these issues already worked out? Then things will move a lot faster. But again, some of the delay tactics have been saying that is not how this works. We need to all be in the same room. It's unfair if you have these meetings where not everyone can join. But I think this new chair will really set the standard for that, of saying, I agree, it's not perfect, but this is what we need. And that I think could rejuvenate the process. So as an optimist, that's maybe where I'm leaning, but I don't know if that's based on just naivety more than actual reality.
Oh, it's manifesting.
We're manifesting for 2026 a treaty.
Yeah, exactly. So we know what happened, we know where we stand right now and what possible next steps are. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned the current basically worst case scenario would be a pretty weak treaty, but one where we can start from. And I don't want to turn this into a societal critique, basically, but I think we don't just see this in the plastic treaty, that we're fighting over words so much instead of focusing on action. And you represent an alliance where at least I hope that a lot of people think that this is an issue, that we have the innovation ready, we basically know what to do. And then at the same time, you see the grown-ups fight over words, where you're sitting there and you say, okay, let's go. What does the alliance that you represent stand for? What's your position?
Yeah, so I represent the Innovation Alliance for a Global Plastics Treaty, which is a coalition of innovators, startups, entrepreneurs, but also basically just any organization that's on the ground doing the work needed to, fight plastic pollution. And so this could be along the whole value chain. So we have innovators that are working on alternative materials. We have innovators working on reuse and refill, on cleanup, and basically the whole spectrum. We've got representatives across the world.
Cleanup is part of that as well.
Yes.
We're also part of the business coalition. Yeah. Full transparency.
And we're not a very activistic group. It's more just we want to make sure that there's a voice for the innovators and the SMEs in the treaty negotiation process. So we send representatives to be there in the rooms to talk to people, to understand what's going on. So we can also be a link between our members and the process, because like Joel said earlier, you don't necessarily have the time to follow this process. It's complicated. I had to learn all of this jargon. I had to sit in this room and realize I didn't understand what was going on and do my homework. We don't expect startups that have a million other things on their list to do this work, but we also recognize that there is a big impact that can come from regulation like this, and we don't want our innovators to be left behind. So we're sort of that bridge between this high-level policy and those working on the ground. And we're completely like a voluntary, nonprofit coalition. We were founded by Repurpose Global and the Ocean Cleanup, so two, innovative companies working in this field for many years. And we're trying to be a seat in that room for our members that cannot. And also looking ahead to 2026, we want to focus also more on sort of like bringing more awareness about the innovation that's happening on the ground, because I think sometimes there is this idea of there isn't enough solutions, or, that, there's definitely not enough investment. And one hope is that something like the treaty will catalyze more investment, because it'll have security, it'll have stability in the market. But there's no reason why that investment can't start right now. I mean, you see the writing on the wall. The treaty is being discussed. Countries are taking note of this. And leader countries like within the EU are already setting stricter regulations. So I think most companies and governments recognize like this is what's happening. And then at the same time, there are solution providers and innovators who are doing this work on the ground that realized that companies and governments were not doing the work and said, well, I can do it in the meantime. I can fill this gap. I can come up with a creative business model. And it's sort of like, if we can harmonize these things to be moving in the same direction with financing, with, regulatory stability, and coherence, then there's no reason why this can't be amplified. So we're going to work more on that in 2026 as well, recognizing that the treaty is going to take a long time. People are doing amazing work in the meantime. How can we get their work more known and connect them to the right people to scale, and sort of say like, hey, negotiators, while you're sitting in these rooms talking, we're actually doing something.
Are there already concrete plans on how to do that?
There are, but it's the start of the new year, so they haven't fully been realized. But what we want to do is create a sort of atlas, an atlas is a map. So mapping where all of our innovators are working, which level of the value chain, and be able to link that to sort of key targets to end plastic pollution. So a big report, an update came out this year, is the Towards Ending Plastic Pollution report by Pew. And they basically show that by investing in different strategies, you can sort of like reduce pollution in the environment by certain percentages. So what we want to do is link some of that sort of like large scale knowledge on like, hey, if we really invest in reuse and refill, we can reduce 20% of pollution in the environment. And then we can say, well, we've got all of these innovators in all of these countries working on reuse, refill. If you invest in them, we can help reach that. So kind of like concretizing, I don't know if that's a word, but really making the direct, tangible link between some of these sort of like high-level studies to actual innovators on the ground, and also talking to our innovators and saying, like, what type of financing do you need? When do you need it? You know, what does it look like for you? Because there's so many different financing models, and sort of trying to make the case for, getting that work done and starting to achieve some of those. I mean, you see this graph and you're like, great, all we need to do is these 15 things and we'll end plastic pollution. Easier said than done. So kind of like making a playbook for financiers or governments or development finance organizations to start actioning that research.
It sounds really, really interesting. And maybe to close off, your PhD was on innovation already, if I say that correctly. You
Yes.
had your hands dirty on Henderson Island. You've sat in these policy rooms. Where's your heart at?
I think my heart has always been with the innovators. I mean, I think starting my PhD, I started interviewing entrepreneurs like Joel, you know, working on this problem, and everyone was so motivated and they were just not taking no for an answer. And they saw a problem and they decided they were going to solve it in what I think to be a very creative and important way, and self-sustaining and exciting and all these things. And so where I want to keep working is, you know, during my PhD, I interviewed all these entrepreneurs and I got information from them, and I just like gathered, turned it into papers and published them. And now I feel like what I can do is support the innovators as best I can. So through the Innovation Alliance, through this atlas, through other work, and just do my best to give back, because I think there's so much exciting work being done that I might know about, but other people might not. So amplifying those voices, because they're just extremely motivated individuals all over the world that I think if people heard their stories, they would be inspired themselves to do something, you know, in their own backyard or make a different decision when they go grocery shopping. And I think right now we don't have enough of those stories. So perhaps more storytelling as well.
Well, this is an open invitation. We're part of the business, of the Innovators Alliance. Everyone can come on the show, tell their story, and tell about their innovation. And then maybe we sit here in a year, in January 2027, and we look back at 2026 and say this was the best year yet in trying to solve plastic pollution, and things look great. Let's hope for that.
I will manifest that with you, Joel.
Fantastic. Let's do that. Thank you so much for the summary, Hanna. Thanks so much for all the work that you do for the innovators out there. And connect with her on LinkedIn.
Yes, please do.
Well, what's the best way to get in touch?
You can find Innovation Alliance at iagpt.org, and you can find me at hannadijkstra.com.
Fantastic. Find her there, get in touch, and let's make the world a bit of a cleaner place.
Love it.
Have a great
Bye.
2026. Bye-bye.
Life in plastic.